A small town in the southern United States, 2010. Life here is always measured and predictable. The streets are paved with brick, the houses are neat, with green lawns, and it seems that time has slowed down here. In the center of town, towering over the houses, stands an old church with a pointed bell tower that can be heard for miles around. This church has served as a spiritual stronghold for locals for many years, a place where they come for solace, prayer, and the search for meaning in everyday life. The main figure in this church is Mother Margaret. She is 40 years old, looks serious and confident, but at the same time radiates softness and warmth. Her deep brown eyes and always neatly combed dark hair create the impression of a strict but kind woman who is respected and to whom people come for advice. Her authority in the community is unquestionable. Local residents consider her the supporter of moral values and the true keeper of spiritual traditions. Margaret was born and raised in this town, and from a very early age her life was connected with the church. Her parents were deeply religious people, and from childhood she learned the rules and principles of religious life. When she was 25, she decided to devote herself to service, entering a monastery and then returning to her hometown, where she was appointed head of the local church. Every Sunday the church is filled with people, families with children, older couples, young couples. Everyone comes to hear Margaret preach. For many, she has become not only a spiritual leader but also a symbol of stability in a world full of chaos. She helps organize charity events, supports the community in difficult times, and is always ready to listen to parishioners, regardless of their problems. But beneath this outward harmony lies a personal struggle. No matter how hard Margaret tried to live up to the community's expectations and her own high standards, she always harbored doubts and insecurities inside. By her 40s, she began to feel like her life was passing her by. Despite the respect of her parishioners, she had never had a family of her own, children, or even someone she could confide in outside the church. She had always believed that her destiny was to be a spiritual mentor and support for others. But now she began to feel an emptiness in her life. These thoughts and feelings she carefully hid, for her reputation depended on being a steadfast figure to whom one could turn for advice and comfort. Yet each evening, as she returned to her house near the church, she felt a loneliness that grew stronger with each passing year. It was at this point that Ethan entered her life, a young 17-year-old boy who had been involved with the church since childhood. His parents were devoted churchgoers, and he himself had always been a quiet and kind boy. Ethan was wise beyond his years, and his commitment to spiritual life was admired by many adults in the community. He often helped out at the church, cleaning, preparing the room for events, and always trying to be helpful. Ethan had known Margaret since he was a child, seeing her as a spiritual leader and always admiring her calm and wisdom. But now that he was an adult, his perception had changed. His childhood admiration had grown into something more complex, but he couldn't yet figure out what exactly he was feeling. For him, Margaret had become not only a mentor, but also someone who represented a strength that had been unavailable to him before. He was beginning to be drawn to her image, but he didn't know how to deal with it. Margaret, in turn, also noticed how Ethan had grown and matured. His frequent visits to church had become something familiar to her, but she began to sense something new in these meetings. He was young, sincere, and full of life, everything she had been missing. But Margaret understood that such thoughts were dangerous, and she tried to suppress them in herself, although it was becoming increasingly difficult. With each passing day, their meetings became more personal. Ethan would often stay to help after the service, and they would spend a lot of time together, first discussing religious topics, and then moving on to conversations about life, dreams, and fears. In these conversations, Margaret began to see Ethan not just as a young guy from the community, but as a person she enjoyed spending time with, who filled her life with new energy. Gradually, their meetings became an important part of the day for both of them, although neither of them dared to confess their feelings. Ethan was born and raised in this town, like many of his peers. His family has always been closely connected with the church, and from an early age the boy accompanied his parents to Sunday services. His father, John, was a man of strict principles, adhering to traditional religious views. Ethan's mother, Sarah, was a quiet and kind woman whose life revolved around family and home. Both parents instilled in their son a respect for religion, discipline, and work. Ethan was never a rebellious teenager. Unlike his peers, who often sought out fun and adventure, he preferred peace and quiet. He was more comfortable spending time alone, reflecting on life or doing things at church, than participating in noisy parties. This made him somewhat unusual among his peers, but he was respected in the community for his kindness and responsiveness. From an early age, Ethan was involved in the life of the church. He helped Mother Margaret with various tasks, preparing the hall for the service, lighting candles, and maintaining order in the church. These small duties, which many considered boring, Ethan performed with great responsibility. For him, the church was a place where he could feel useful and needed. He saw his work not just as a duty, but as a calling. By the age of 17, Ethan was mature enough to realize how different his life was from the lives of his peers. He noticed that many of his friends from school had started dating girls, discussing their future plans, dreaming of a free life after graduation. But Ethan himself had never felt drawn to such a lifestyle. His interests had always been elsewhere, in the search for something deeper, in spiritual reflection. Mother Margaret held a special place in Ethan's life. From childhood, he saw her as the embodiment of spiritual strength, wisdom, and calm. She was his example of how to live his life with honor and dignity. With each passing year, their interactions became more personal. At first, he saw her simply as a mentor, then as an authority figure to whom he could turn for advice. But as he grew older, he began to notice that his feelings for her were changing. Ethan himself could not define exactly what he felt for Margaret. He was sure that it was respect and gratitude for her care and attention. However, with each new meeting with her, these feelings grew stronger. He began to think about her more often, about how she looked, how she spoke, how her eyes radiated kindness and understanding. Ethan began to realize that she was more than just a spiritual mentor to him. Margaret, for her part, began to notice changes in Ethan. Her long years of serving in the church and constantly paying attention to the needs of others had made her sensitive to the emotions of those around her. She saw how Ethan became increasingly attentive to her, how he looked forward to each conversation with impatience, how his eyes lit up when she spoke to him. But despite this, she tried to keep her distance, understanding that their relationship should remain within the framework of spiritual mentoring. Ethan began to spend more and more time at the church. He found any excuse to stay longer after the service, to help Margaret with her affairs, looking for an opportunity to talk to her alone. These moments became especially important to him. He could no longer imagine his life without daily meetings with her, without her soft voice and warm words. But along with this, Ethan began to have doubts and internal contradictions. He could not understand why he was so drawn to Margaret. On the one hand, he saw her as an older person, for whom he had always felt nothing but respect. On the other hand, these feelings began to transform into something more complex and frightening to him. Ethan did not dare to share his thoughts with anyone, fearing judgment. A conflict was brewing inside him, which he did not know how to cope with. Every night when he returned home, he would replay his conversations with Margaret in his mind, trying to find answers to his questions. But the more he thought about it, the more confused he became. He knew it wasn't just respect or gratitude. He felt it was more than that. But how could he, a young man who had lived his entire life by moral standards, feel that way about a woman 20 years his senior and a spiritual leader? Ethan soon realized that he could no longer fight this feeling. He began to look for any opportunity to see Margaret, even if it meant going to church after hours or staying up late cleaning the building. He felt drawn to her by some invisible force that he could not resist. At this point, his life began to change. The feelings he had been trying to suppress began to take hold of him more, and this feeling grew with each new encounter with Margaret. Soon, Ethan realized that their connection had already gone beyond what he could control. The more Ethan stayed at the church after the service, the deeper his connection with Mother Margaret became. Every time he helped her clean the place or sorted the books on the shelves, he felt a special closeness develop between them. At first, it was simple conversations, about faith, life in the town, about her experiences. Ethan always admired the wise and calm way Margaret spoke about the things that troubled him. She answered his questions, shared her thoughts about the world, and Ethan began to see life in a different light thanks to her guidance. In these moments, he felt that her presence filled his life with new meaning. Whereas before he came to church to fulfill his duties, now he went there to communicate with her. Their conversations increasingly moved away from simple instructions to more personal topics. Margaret began to share her experiences, talking about how she sometimes felt lonely, despite all the love and respect she received from the congregation. Ethan was shocked that even someone as strong as she could feel lonely. This revelation brought them even closer together. He began to feel that he could be the one to give her the comfort and support she so lacked. In young Ethan's eyes, it was like a calling to be there for her, to care for her the way she cared for everyone else. One day, when they were alone again in the church, Ethan decided to ask the question that had been on the tip of his tongue for a long time. He asked Margaret how she handled so much responsibility without ever showing that it was hard. She replied with a slight smile, "Sometimes it is very hard, but I try not to show it because people expect strength from me. They come to me for comfort, and I cannot allow myself to be weak." Ethan sensed the deep pain hidden in her words. It seemed to him that her life was a constant sacrifice for others. For the first time, he realized how much she probably missed someone with whom she could just be herself, without having to always be the perfect spiritual mentor. In that moment, he felt a desire to protect her, to be the one who could truly understand her. Their meetings became longer and longer with each passing day. Sometimes Ethan would stay in the church until late in the evening, and they would sit together in the semi-darkness, surrounded by silence, broken only by the rustling of book pages or quiet conversations. There was a special atmosphere in these meetings, a sense of calm and peace. Margaret gradually began to open up to Ethan more. She talked about her childhood, about how in her youth she dreamed of a family, but chose the ministry, feeling that it was her duty to dedicate her life to religion. These confessions touched Ethan to the depths of his soul. One evening when Margaret was telling him about her youth, Ethan dared to ask a more personal question. "Have you ever regretted choosing this path, that you don't have your own family?" Margaret thought for a moment, her expression wistful. "Sometimes," she said quietly. "There are moments when I wonder what my life might have been like if I had chosen a different path. But then I realize that it was my choice, and I have no right to complain." Her voice was calm, but Ethan sensed the melancholy hidden in her words. These conversations brought them closer together, and Ethan increasingly realized that his feelings for Margaret went beyond simple admiration. He began to catch himself thinking about her constantly. Her smile, her voice, her warm and wise words occupied his entire consciousness. It was hard for him to imagine his life without these evening meetings at church, without her presence nearby. He did not dare tell her about his feelings, but inside he was torn apart by contradictions. He understood that his attraction to her went beyond moral norms and contradicted everything he had been taught since childhood. One day, when they were alone again, Ethan noticed that Margaret seemed especially tired and thoughtful. He asked her if everything was okay, and she said that sometimes it was hard for her to cope with the pressure she felt. She felt alone in her role as a spiritual leader, despite all the support from her congregation. "It feels like I have to be strong for everyone, but no one knows how hard it is," she said, and Ethan felt his heart clench for her. He wanted to comfort her, but he didn't know how. All words seemed insufficient. He saw her pain, her inner struggle, and he felt like he could help her cope with it just by being there. He gently took her hand and said, "You are not alone. I am here, and I will always be here." The words were quiet, but they were filled with sincerity. Margaret looked at him, and there was something in her eyes that Ethan couldn't quite read. Was it gratitude, longing, or perhaps something more? She didn't remove her hand, and the gesture made Ethan feel like their connection had deepened even further. It was the first physical touch that carried more than friendship. Ethan felt something shift inside him. That night, he went home with the feeling that their relationship had reached a new level. He could no longer deny what he felt for Margaret. She was no longer just his mother, his spiritual leader, or his mentor. He began to see her as a woman he was drawn to, despite all his inhibitions and morals. These feelings began to overwhelm him with new strength, and he realized that their relationship could no longer be called a simple friendship. But what did Margaret herself feel? Ethan didn't know. She remained a mystery to him, although he now felt that their connection was greater than ever, despite her outward calm and reserve. After that night when Ethan first took her hand, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about it. He didn't say anything unnecessary. His touch was light, but there was such sincerity and care in it that she couldn't forget it. From then on, every time she saw Ethan in church, her heart began to beat faster. She tried to control herself, convincing herself that all this was simple affection caused by her loneliness. But something inside her resisted this explanation. It was becoming increasingly difficult for her to remain calm. Their conversations continued, but there was something in them that had been missing before. Margaret could feel the tension. She saw the way Ethan looked at her, not as a mother or a mentor, but as a woman. It filled her heart with turmoil. She was a deeply religious woman who had dedicated her life to service. But now, for the first time in years, there was someone in her life who made her think about how much she had lost by choosing this path. Margaret had never thought about changing her life. Her work at the church was everything to her. She was convinced that her purpose was to help people, to guide them, to lead them on their journey of faith. But her encounters with Ethan began to awaken feelings in her that she had long thought buried. It was both excitement and anxiety. She felt like she was losing control, but she couldn't stop. Ethan, for his part, was also caught up in conflicting emotions. He felt his attraction to Margaret growing stronger. Every word, every gesture, every look only intensified the feeling. He began to feel that their connection was more than just spiritual. His thoughts became obsessed with her. When he went to bed, he thought of her smile, her soft voice. He found himself constantly anticipating their next meeting, and each time it became harder for him to hide his true feelings. One evening, when they were alone again in the church after the service, Ethan felt that he could no longer contain himself. Their conversation, as usual, began with the usual topics. They discussed the latest news in the congregation, talked about what they had to do the following weekend. But the further the conversation went, the more Ethan felt himself overwhelmed with emotion. He looked at Margaret, and at some point, everything he had been holding in for so long burst out. "Margaret, I have something to tell you," he began, his voice shaking with emotion. She looked up at him with a little alarm. She could see that something was wrong, but she didn't know what to expect. "I can't hide it anymore," Ethan continued. I can't stop thinking about you. You're all I think about every day. I know it's wrong. I know we shouldn't have gotten this close, but I can't hold back these feelings anymore." Margaret froze. Her heart started beating faster when she heard those words. She knew he felt something, but she hadn't expected it to be so obvious. Thoughts flashed through her mind that this was unacceptable, that she should stop him, stop this talk. But something inside her protested. "Ethan, she began, but didn't know what to say next. Ethan, without waiting for her answer, continued, "I know that you are older than me. I know that it is wrong, but I can't change it. You are more than just a mentor to me. You are the only person with whom I feel alive. You are the only one who understands me, who can listen and support me. I don't know what to do with these feelings." Margaret took a deep breath. She tried to collect her thoughts. Everything inside her was telling her that this had to stop, that she had to take a step back. But something was stopping her from doing so. Her gaze lingered on Ethan longer than usual. For the first time, she allowed herself to look at him not as a young man she was spiritually nurturing, but as a person she cared about. "Ethan, this is a very difficult situation," she finally answered, trying to keep her voice calm. "I understand how you feel, but you have to understand that this can't continue. We can't have anything other than a spiritual connection. You have to realize that." But despite these words, everything inside her was clenching. She herself did not believe what she was saying. Her feelings for Ethan, as well as his for her, had already gone beyond friendship or mentorship. She realized this, but she could not accept it. Ethan was silent. He listened to her words, but he couldn't agree with them. It seemed to him that she was trying to hide her true emotions, just as he had hidden his until now. He took a step closer to her. "I know you feel the same way," he said quietly. "I can see it in your eyes. You can't deny it either." Margaret didn't know how to respond. He was right. She couldn't deny that she was drawn to him, that these feelings were real. But how could she allow herself to do this? How could she go against everything she believed in for this? Her head and her heart were at odds. She stood up, took a step back, and said, "Ethan, please understand, I can't let this go on. It's not right." But her voice wasn't as firm as she wanted it to be. Ethan could feel it. He knew she wasn't sure of her words. He took another step forward, and the distance between them was reduced to a minimum. Her breathing became more rapid, and she felt herself losing control of the situation. This moment was crucial. Everything they had been feeling for the past weeks had finally burst out. The tension that had been building between them had reached its peak. Margaret knew that if she didn't stop him now, their connection would be irreversible. But despite this, she could not move. The tension in the room grew with each passing moment. Margaret stood across from Ethan, feeling her inner world crumbling under the weight of emotions she could no longer control. All those years of holding back her feelings, serving the church and people, seemed to lose all meaning in the face of these strong, unknown emotions. Ethan was only a boy, but his presence and feelings were so powerful that she could not ignore them. Ethan, realizing that Margaret was holding back only because of her moral convictions, had no intention of stopping. His attraction to her had reached its peak, and he could not imagine his life without her. He felt that if they did not allow these feelings to come out now, it would break them both. He wanted Margaret to admit her love for him and cast aside all her fears. "Margaret, I can't live without you," Ethan whispered, taking another step closer. He was almost touching her now, and the tension was unbearable. Margaret didn't know how to react. Her mind told her that this was wrong, that everything she had worked towards her entire life could crumble in an instant. But her heart said otherwise. She felt something for Ethan that she had never felt before. It was terrifying, but also exciting. "Ethan, this can't go on," she said with difficulty, her voice quiet, almost trembling. But Ethan couldn't stop. It seemed to him that only now they were on the threshold of something important. He grabbed her hand, and in that moment, everything changed. Margaret felt his warmth, his determination, and it broke down the last barriers she had tried to erect inside herself. "You have to be with me, Margaret. You want it too." His words sounded insistent, almost desperate, but what happened next was unexpected. Margaret pulled away abruptly. Her face changed, as if she suddenly realized the full horror of the situation. What happened in that moment was like waking up from a nightmare. Her inner world had collapsed, but now she saw it differently, as an unforgivable fall. Fear and pain lit up her eyes. "No, Ethan, this is a mistake. This is wrong. Go away!" She suddenly screamed, her voice echoing off the walls of the church. Ethan froze. That scream, that sudden change filled him with anger and disappointment. He couldn't believe she'd rejected him so quickly after everything that had happened between them. Everything he'd felt, all the love and affection turned to rage in that moment. "You can't just push me away!" Ethan screamed, his face contorted in pain and anger. He couldn't handle the emotions that overwhelmed him at that moment. Margaret tried to pull away. Her breathing became ragged, and she felt that the situation was getting out of control. She didn't know how to calm him down anymore. At this moment, everything around her seemed chaotic and destroyed. She took a step back, hoping that Ethan would leave, but this only made the situation worse. "You're leaving me after starting all this?" His voice was rough, and he came too close to her. There was something wild in his eyes. A short but intense argument broke out. Ethan was no longer in control of his actions, and Margaret was trying to get away from him. She tried to break away, but he grabbed her shoulder. At that moment, everything happened quickly and terribly. Ethan, overcome with anger and despair, suddenly struck Margaret. He did not realize what he was doing. His mind was clouded by despair and pain. Margaret fell to the floor, hitting her head on the edge of the altar. Silence hung in the air for a moment. Blood began to slowly trickle across the floor, and Ethan froze, realizing what had just happened. He stood there in complete shock, his body numb and his mind clouded. He looked at Margaret's motionless body, her face pale and a dark spot spreading around her head. He didn't want this. It all happened so fast that he didn't have time to process his actions. The church was deathly silent. Ethan fell to his knees beside Margaret's body, his breathing ragged, his hands shaking. He told himself it was a mistake, that he hadn't meant to hurt her. But it was too late. After it happened, the church was eerily silent. Ethan knelt before Margaret's lifeless body, his thoughts confused and his emotions overwhelmed. All he could see in front of him was her pale face, her eyes closed forever, and the dark blood spreading across the floor. He couldn't believe that this was real. It felt like a nightmare from which he was about to wake up. It was as if time had stopped. He couldn't tell how many minutes or hours had passed, but the realization of what had just happened was slowly creeping into his consciousness. Ethan didn't want to believe that he had killed Margaret. He repeated it to himself over and over again. It was a mistake. I didn't mean to do it. He muttered under his breath, as if trying to convince himself that it could still be changed. But the reality was unforgiving. Her dead body lay before him, and every time he looked at the blood that covered her hair and shoulders, the feeling of guilt washed over him with new force. Panic took hold of him. What had he done? How could this have happened? Hundreds of thoughts flashed through his head, but none of them brought answers or relief. He realized that if anyone found out what had happened, his life would be ruined. Everyone in town, the entire community, the church, his family, everyone would turn their backs on him. He would be arrested, sent to prison, and that would be the end of everything. Ethan couldn't let that happen. He didn't want to become a murderer in the eyes of the people who had known him since he was a child. Panic turned into desperate attempts to find a way out of the situation. His gaze darted around the church, and the only thought that came to his mind was to get rid of the traces as quickly as possible. But what could he do? Margaret's body lay in the middle of the church, her blood already covering the floor around the altar. And no matter what he did, he couldn't change the fact that she was dead. His first impulse was to run, to leave everything as it was and hide, but he knew that would only make things worse. If he ran, everyone would immediately know it was him. His absence would arouse suspicion. He needed to act quickly and calmly, but Ethan was incapable of calm. A storm was raging inside him. Ethan rose to his feet, his body shaking, and he could barely keep himself from falling to his knees again. He needed to come up with a plan. He looked around, his mind racing for any clue. The church was empty. No one was around, which gave him a small head start. But what next? The body had to be hidden. He walked up to Margaret, carefully took her hands and tried to lift her. Her body was heavy, and Ethan felt as if his strength had left him completely. He knew he had to move her, but he had no plan, no clear idea of where he could hide her. Every movement was difficult. His hands were shaking. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of his chest. He dragged Margaret's body across the floor, leaving bloody footprints behind him. All he could think of was to hide her in the church basement, where they kept old things that were rarely touched. But even that seemed like a bad idea, because sooner or later the body would be found. He opened the door to the basement, looking around as if he was afraid someone was watching him, although there was no one around. He went downstairs, laid the body on the floor, and began frantically searching for something to cover it with. There were old boxes of books on the shelves, dusty blankets from previous church events. He threw a few blankets over Margaret's body, trying to hide her, but it was unconvincing. Ethan felt trapped. No matter how hard he tried to hide her, the body would be found. When he finished, Ethan sat on the floor, clutching his head. He didn't know what to do next. His mind was in turmoil, and every time he tried to come up with a plan, the panic returned with renewed vigor. He could feel everything crumbling. His world, his life. It was all destroyed in one moment. He had to leave. He had to leave as soon as possible. But how? There were witnesses in the church that he had been there with Margaret that evening. If anyone asked where she was, he would be the first person they would suspect. Ethan couldn't think of a way to avoid suspicion. He ran out of the basement and stopped in front of the church's front door. He froze for a moment, breathing heavily. One thought was beating in his head. I have to get out of here before anyone sees me. And without looking back, He ran out of the church. Night had already fallen on the city when Ethan ran out into the street. The streets were quiet, and no one saw him leave, trying to hide in the darkness. But inside, he was gnawing at the thought that this night would be the beginning of the end. The next day, the church looked like any other, but within its walls lurked a terrible secret that no one knew yet. The morning sun shone through the old windows, and the town began to wake up. People were gathering for Sunday service, as was customary every week. The parishioners moved along familiar routes, approaching the church, unaware of what awaited them. The first to arrive was Deacon Thomas, an old and faithful churchman who helped Margaret organize the service every Sunday. He was surprised when he approached the building to find the church doors unlocked, which was most unusual for Mother Margaret. She always left the doors locked after the evening's events, and Thomas knew she was strict about it. As Thomas entered the church, he felt a strange tension. Something was wrong. Usually by now, Margaret would be there, preparing the service and greeting the congregation, but she was nowhere to be seen. Thomas called out to her several times, but there was no response. He began to look around the church, thinking she might be in one of the back rooms, but as he walked around the building, his anxiety grew. Parishioners began to gather at the church, waiting for the service to begin. Several people were already standing at the threshold, looking at each other in surprise. Some could not understand why the church was still empty. Others began to suggest that Mother Margaret might have been delayed for some important reason. Thomas, still missing Margaret, decided to check the basement, where she sometimes went to get old books or things that were used for church events. The basement was a place that was rarely visited, and only he and Margaret had keys to the room. But when Thomas approached the door, he noticed that it was slightly open. This made him wary. As Thomas walked down the creaky wooden steps and turned on the dim light, he immediately smelled a scent that filled him with dread. It was a scent that could not be confused with anything else. His heart began to beat faster, and a dark thought flashed through his mind. Something terrible had happened. The lamplight illuminated the musty basement, and Thomas saw her. Margaret's body lay under a pile of old blankets that someone had carelessly thrown over her, as if trying to hide this heinous crime. The blood caked on the floor indicated that the murder had occurred the day before. Thomas froze in place, realizing the horror of the situation. He could not believe that someone could kill Margaret, the person he had known all his life, the woman who was a model of virtue and service to everyone. For a moment, Thomas couldn't move. His mind refused to accept the reality of what he was seeing. He was paralyzed with shock, his hands shaking, his breathing ragged. It seemed as if time had stopped. He stood before Margaret's body, unable to comprehend the horror of what had happened. But then, realizing that he had to do something, he ran headlong up the steps, stumbling over them, and rushed toward the church doors. The parishioners were already waiting for him at the door, not understanding why the service had not yet begun. But when they saw the expression on Thomas's face, they realized that something terrible had happened. She's dead, Thomas finally gasped, barely able to stay on his feet. His voice was quiet, but in the silence his words were thunder. The congregation froze, unsure of what he meant. Mother Margaret, she's murdered, he said, his voice shaking. For a moment, everyone stood in complete silence, stunned by his words. It was impossible. How could Margaret, the symbol of goodness and mercy, be killed? Everyone knew her, everyone loved her, and no one could even imagine that someone could wish her harm. Shock and horror slowly overtook everyone present. Panic began to spread. People began to whisper in fear, not understanding how this could have happened. One of the parishioners, having recovered from the shock, immediately called the police. Soon the city was filled with police cars, and the church, which was once a symbol of peace and tranquility, turned into a place where a monstrous crime had taken place. The police immediately cordoned off the area, and the church basement was turned into a crime scene. Rumors spread around the city with incredible speed. Local residents, hearing about what happened, were horrified. Everyone knew Margaret, respected and loved her. Her death shocked not only those who were in the church that day, but also everyone who had ever crossed paths with her. More and more questions arose. Who could have committed such a terrible crime? Why? And most importantly, who was guilty of her death? As the police began their investigation, the city was gripped by fear and bewilderment. When the police arrived, the church was already filled with anxious parishioners, standing in groups, whispering and looking around at the building, as if hoping that this would all be a mistake. However, with each passing minute, reality became more and more inexorable. The appearance of investigators and a medical team only increased the fear and bewilderment among the people. Margaret's body was removed from the basement and carefully packed for further autopsy. The police cordoned off the building and began questioning everyone who had been at the service that day or was nearby. The town was small, everyone knew each other, and the murder of the local spiritual leader became the most high-profile crime in its history. The police station was inundated with calls from worried residents, and the media began to spread the news of the tragedy. Everyone was talking about one thing: how could something like this happen in their quiet and seemingly safe town? The lead investigator on the case was Detective Jackson McKinley, a seasoned officer who had been with the city's police department for more than a decade. He had seen many horrors in his career, but the murder of Margaret's mother shocked him. He knew her personally. After all, in such a small town, everyone talked to everyone else. For him, this was not just a case, but a personal tragedy. He knew that this crime needed to be solved as quickly as possible. Otherwise, the city could be plunged into paranoia and fear. Jackson immediately began gathering information. The first person he questioned was Deacon Thomas, the man who had found the body. Thomas was still in shock. His shaking hands and halting voice made it difficult for him to tell the whole story at first, but over time he was able to gather his thoughts. "I came to church early in the morning, as usual," Thomas began, rubbing his hands nervously. "The doors were open, and that made me wary. Margaret always made sure everything was locked at night. I called out to her, but she didn't answer. So I started looking for her and—" He paused, closing his eyes as if trying to push away the horrible memories. "When I got down to the basement, I saw her there, under a pile of blankets." Jackson listened carefully. He knew Thomas couldn't have been involved. His reaction was too sincere, and besides, he hadn't been seen with Margaret the night of the murder. But that didn't mean Thomas couldn't know more than he realized. "Did you see anyone near the church the day before? Maybe someone came to see Margaret?" Jackson asked, trying to find at least some trace. Thomas shook his head. "No, I didn't. Everything was as usual. We finished the evening service, I went home, and Margaret stayed. She often stayed late to clean or prepare something for the next day." This information was useful, but it did not answer the main question. Who could have committed this crime? Jackson knew he needed more witnesses. He sent his deputies to question parishioners and nearby neighbors of the church, but so far this was not yielding results. Detectives soon received their first clues from the crime scene. Blood on the church floor indicated that the murder had taken place there, near the altar, and that the body had then been dragged into the basement. There were no signs of a struggle, meaning that the victim probably had not expected the attack. This supported the theory that the killer knew Margaret and was perhaps even close to her. However, the murder weapon was not found, making the investigation more difficult. Meanwhile, the town began to seethe with rumors. Everyone wanted to know who could have committed such a terrible crime. One of the most popular versions among the residents was that the killer could have been one of the parishioners. People began to suspect each other, and all sorts of rumors began to circulate in the town. Some even claimed that the murder could have been the result of an unsuccessful relationship, but there was no evidence for this. As investigators worked through evidence and interviewed witnesses, Jackson's attention gradually turned to those closest to Margaret in her final weeks. One of those people was Ethan, a young church assistant who often stayed after services to help Margaret with her daily chores. Several parishioners mentioned his name when asked about people who might have been close to Margaret in the days before her death. When Jackson first heard Ethan's name, he didn't think much of it. Ethan was young and seemed like a quiet, trustworthy guy. But the more he learned about how often Ethan was around Margaret, the more suspicious he became. Ethan had been seen at church on the day of the murder, which was a big deal. Jackson decided to invite Ethan in for questioning. When the guy came to the station, he seemed calm, but Jackson immediately noticed that something was wrong with him. Ethan was not so much scared as withdrawn and tense. He did not want to talk about recent events and tried to avoid specific answers. "Did you help Margaret often? When was the last time you saw her?" Jackson asked, looking closely at Ethan. "Yes, I helped her. I was at the church the day she died, but I left before anything terrible happened," Ethan replied, his voice hoarse. Jackson noticed that Ethan was avoiding eye contact. This made him suspicious, but he didn't want to jump to conclusions. He knew that the boy could simply be shocked by Margaret's death, but his behavior didn't match the usual reactions to tragedy. "Can you tell me what you were doing in the church that night? Were you there alone?" The detective continued asking questions, trying to find a clue. Ethan sighed nervously and looked away. "I was just helping her with her books. She asked me to help, and then I left. I don't know what happened after that." His answers were short and unclear. Jackson knew there was more to the words, but he couldn't quite figure out what it was yet. He let go of Ethan, but he was sure there was more to him than met the eye. Detective Jackson couldn't shake off the unsettling thoughts after his conversation with Ethan. Something about the guy's behavior seemed wrong, unnatural. He was too tense, his answers were too short, and his eyes constantly eluded direct contact. This didn't fit the picture Jackson was used to seeing in such cases. The young man seemed to be hiding something, and this was bothering the detective. After the interrogation, Jackson called his colleagues together for a brief meeting to discuss his new suspicions. "Something's wrong with this guy. He was at church that night, and his answers are too vague. We need to dig deeper," Jackson said, reviewing the interrogation notes. One of the junior detectives, Sam, who also looked into the case, added, "I spoke to a few members of the congregation. They mentioned that Ethan spent a lot of time with Margaret. Some even began to suggest that there might have been some closeness between them, more than just friendship. It might have been something more." These words caused a heated discussion among the detectives. Was it possible that young Ethan had romantic feelings for Margaret that he could not control? If so, it would explain his strange behavior and why he tried to avoid talking about the last days before her death. Jackson decided to dig deeper. He sent his staff to find witnesses who could shed light on the relationship between Ethan and Margaret. He needed more information to understand what exactly might have been going on behind the closed doors of the church. The more he thought about it, the more his suspicions grew. Meanwhile, Ethan was at home, but his mind was completely consumed by panic. He couldn't focus on anything. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of Margaret appeared before him, her dead body, her face covered in blood. He knew that he had committed a terrible crime, and it gave him no peace. But the worst thing was that he knew that the police would soon connect the dots and come for him. Ethan tried to act as normal, but it became more and more difficult with each passing day. His family noticed that something was wrong with him, but he avoided conversations and tried to spend more time in his room, closing himself off from everyone. Tormenting thoughts filled with fear and guilt took over him completely. Every night he tossed and turned in his bed, remembering that fateful moment when he lost control and hit Margaret. The day after the interrogation, Detective Jackson received new information. One of the witnesses, a parishioner, claimed to have seen Ethan and Margaret often alone in the church after services. This made him suspicious, but he did not pay much attention to it until he heard about her death. Now this witness was sure that there could be something more between them. This information was key. Jackson could now hypothesize that there was genuine emotion between Ethan and Margaret. Perhaps Ethan was in love with her, and she didn't reciprocate. Or perhaps their relationship had crossed a line that had tragic consequences. Both options seemed possible, and Jackson now had a working theory that Ethan might have killed Margaret in a fit of rage or despair. "We need to gather more evidence. If Ethan had a motive, we need to find out," Jackson told his team firmly. He knew the charges couldn't be based on pure conjecture, and he needed concrete evidence that would link Ethan to the crime. Jackson decided to call Ethan in for questioning again. This time, he was going to put pressure on him and try to get the truth out of him. However, the guy didn't answer the police call. This made Jackson wary. Perhaps Ethan realized that the circle was narrowing and decided to avoid talking to the police. This was a bad sign. The detective decided to act quickly. Together with his colleagues, they headed to Ethan's house to meet him in person. When they arrived, his mother met them at the door, worried and confused. Ethan has been locked in his room since this morning and refuses to talk to anyone. I don't know what's wrong with him, she said, her voice shaking with anxiety. Jackson and his colleagues asked to speak with Ethan, and the mother reluctantly agreed, letting them in. When they reached Ethan's door, Jackson knocked, but there was no answer. He tried again, but still heard no sound from inside. The tension was mounting. Jackson felt the situation might get out of control. Ethan, open the door, we need to talk, Jackson said urgently, trying to remain calm, although there was already a sense of anxiety in the air. Finally, footsteps came from behind the door. Ethan opened the door, his face pale, his eyes full of terror. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Jackson immediately realized that the guy was on edge. His nerves were stretched to the limit, and the detective felt that every next step could lead to unpredictable consequences. Ethan, you have to tell us the truth. We know there was something between you and Margaret. You were there that night. We know that, Jackson said bluntly, looking Ethan in the eye. The boy froze. His lips twitched, and he looked away. Jackson could see that Ethan was about to crack under the pressure. All he needed was a little more pressure, and the truth would come out. We can help you, but to do that, we need you to tell the truth, the detective continued, stepping forward. Ethan slowly raised his head, his eyes filling with tears. He could no longer hide the truth, but the words still stuck in his throat. Ethan stood before Detective Jackson as if before an abyss. His inner world had long been destroyed by guilt, fear, and constant pressure, but at this moment, he felt that he could lose everything. His pale face, dark circles under his eyes, and trembling hands betrayed a state of absolute nervous exhaustion. He knew that the police were close to a solution, but the thought that he could escape punishment if he said something convincing still flickered in his head. Jackson noticed that Ethan was on the verge of a breakdown. This was the moment when a suspect would either break and confess or try to hide behind another lie. The detective knew that he had to act carefully but decisively. Ethan, Jackson began quietly, trying to soften his tone. I know this is hard for you. I can see that you're carrying a heavy burden, but the truth has to come out. If you tell us everything, we can help you. But if you keep silent or lie, things will only get worse. Ethan stared at the floor, trying to control his breathing. He felt trapped, but conflicted inside. He wanted to confess, but something inside still held him back. Memories of that fateful night flashed before his eyes. How he lost control, how he hit Margaret, how her body collapsed on the floor, and how blood began to flow down her face. These images haunted him, and he knew he would never be able to get rid of them. You were with her that night, weren't you? Jackson continued. His voice was soft, but there was a firmness to it. We know you were in the church. Witnesses saw you, and we have evidence that you were alone when it happened. You need to tell us what happened. You shouldn't have to bear this burden alone. Ethan took a deep breath, his shoulders shaking slightly. He knew there was no time for lies anymore. Jackson was right. They knew too much, and his attempts to hide from the truth would only make things worse for him. But confessing meant facing the consequences of his actions. He wasn't ready for that, but he had no choice. I didn't mean to, Ethan finally said, his voice almost a whisper. It sounded like he was telling the truth for the first time in a long time. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he covered his face with his hands, as if trying to hide from reality. Jackson sensed that Ethan was about to open up completely. He knew he needed to give him space now, so he could talk. The detective took a step back, giving Ethan time to collect his thoughts. What happened, Ethan? Jackson asked softly. What happened that night? Ethan took his hands away from his face, his eyes filled with tears, and he finally began to speak. I came to church to help her, like always. She asked me to stay after the service because she needed to sort out books, prepare something for Sunday's service. We started talking. I don't know how it happened, but everything became, somehow, different. His voice shook. He was clearly in great internal torment, and each new step towards confession was unbearable for him. I was in love with her, Ethan finally admitted, his voice breaking and him silent for a moment. The words were so heavy for him that he could barely say them out loud. But after he said them, it became a little easier. The truth was starting to spill out. I couldn't help it. I knew it was wrong. I knew she was older, that she was my mother, but I couldn't help it. I thought about her every day. I just wanted her to be here. Jackson nodded, letting Ethan know he heard him. This was important. The detective knew he needed to let the boy talk now, so he could free himself from what had been tormenting him for so long. What happened next? Jackson asked, continuing the conversation in the same tone. Ethan paused again, as if collecting his thoughts. We talked, and I told her. I told her I loved her. But she couldn't accept it. She started saying that it was wrong, that we couldn't be together. She tried to push me away. And then His voice began to shake again, and he was breathing heavily, as if the words were causing him physical pain. You lost control, Jackson finished quietly for him. Yeah, Ethan said, barely audible. He clenched his fists, his body tense as a taut string. I didn't mean to, I was desperate. I hit her and she fell. I wasn't thinking. I just wanted her to stop pushing me away. And then… Ethan trailed off, his voice trailing off as if he couldn't continue. Jackson understood that this was a confession to murder. A young man, overcome by emotions, lost control and did something irreversible. The detective saw before him not a hardened criminal, but a broken guy who was unable to cope with his feelings and experiences. But despite this, the crime was committed, and the consequences will be severe. After that, you hid her body in the basement, right? Jackson asked, trying to complete the chain of events. Ethan nodded. I didn't know what to do. I was just scared. I didn't want this. It was all out of control. I thought that if I hid her, everything would somehow work out. But I knew it was wrong. I just couldn't accept what had happened. Jackson nodded. He saw a man crushed by guilt and fear. The police now had a full confession, but that didn't make the horror of what had happened any easier. A life had been destroyed, and justice lay ahead for Ethan. Ethan, Jackson said quietly, you're going to have to answer for what you've done. We're going to take you to the station, but I want you to understand that this isn't the end. You can start over if you're honest until the end. Ethan nodded, his eyes still full of tears. He knew that his life was now changed forever. After Ethan's confession, Detective Jackson received vital information that allowed him to move the investigation forward. The young man's confession was a key moment in the case, but in order to convict him, more evidence had to be collected to corroborate his words and connect him to the crime scene. The first step was to return to the church for a detailed examination of the basement and the altar. The forensics team carefully examined every detail of the murder scene. It was important not only to confirm Ethan's version of events, but also to find physical evidence that could finally establish his guilt. Upon examination of the floor near the altar, traces of blood were found. These stains had begun to dry, but their number and location matched the spot where Margaret had been hit and fallen, according to Ethan's confession. Blood analysis confirmed that it belonged to Margaret. This confirmed that the attack had occurred exactly where Ethan had said it had. In addition, forensics found several small pieces of fabric on the floor that could be associated with the criminal's clothing. These pieces of fabric were sent for examination to determine whether they belonged to Ethan or someone else. Jackson was confident that the test results would confirm the version that these traces were from Ethan's clothing. Another important discovery was fingerprints on items in the basement. Although Ethan often helped out at the church, and his prints would be expected on many items, investigators focused on prints left on the blankets that covered Margaret's body. Their analysis showed that the prints belonged to Ethan, confirming his involvement in hiding the body. In addition, it was decided to conduct DNA testing on the blood residue found on Margaret's clothes and the floor. All samples were sent to the lab, and within a few days, the results showed an exact match to Ethan's DNA, which definitively linked him to the murder. One of the most significant pieces of evidence was the presence of injuries on Margaret's body that matched the blow described by Ethan. The medical examiner confirmed that the cause of death was a severe blow to the head, which caused a cerebral hemorrhage. This data completely matched the version of events that Ethan had told. In addition to physical evidence, the investigation also gathered testimony from witnesses who had seen Ethan in the church on the day of the murder. Although these people had previously dismissed the fact that Ethan had stayed with Margaret, their testimony now became important. They confirmed that they had seen Ethan shortly before the tragedy, and that he was the only one who had stayed with her that evening. Jackson, having received all this information, realized that the case was practically closed. Ethan's confession, the evidence found, and the testimony of witnesses came together to form a single picture. Now there was no doubt that the young man was guilty of Margaret's murder. Once all the evidence was collected, Jackson prepared the case for trial. He knew that this process would not be easy, because the city was shocked by the tragedy. Many residents could not believe until the last moment that the quiet and good-natured Ethan could commit such a terrible crime. Meanwhile, Ethan remained in custody, awaiting trial. His confession and the evidence that had been found made his case incontestable. However, even though the truth had come out, the horror of what had happened and the consequences of his actions would test the entire community. The city gradually began to realize that behind the mask of a quiet helper, there was tension and internal conflict that led to tragedy. After Detective Jackson had collected all the necessary evidence, it was only a matter of time before Ethan was arrested. The town was in shock. For days, the only thing everyone was talking about was Margaret's murder and Ethan's sudden confession. Many residents simply could not believe that such a quiet, kind-hearted, and religious young man, whom everyone had known since childhood, could be guilty of such a terrible crime. The community, which had always been tightly knit, began to crack at the seams under waves of rumors, suspicions, and accusations. When the police arrived at Ethan's house to arrest him, the streets of the city were practically empty. People did not go out, avoiding unnecessary meetings and conversations. Local residents felt fear of the unknown and horror at what had happened in their quiet town. Despite this, everyone expected that something important would soon happen. Ethan's arrest was supposed to be the final step in the investigation. The police arrived at the house early in the morning. None of Ethan's family members could believe that their son had become a suspect in a murder. Ethan's mother, Sarah, could not understand for a long time what was happening. Until the last moment, she denied the very possibility that her son could be involved in the crime. Her usually calm life was now turned upside down. Ethan's father, John, a man of strict moral principles, was also devastated by the news. He did not know how to react to it. He was disappointed and could not believe that his son, raised in religious traditions, was involved in a murder. The police arrested Ethan without resistance. He had known this moment was coming and had been preparing for it since his confession. When the patrol cars pulled up to his house, he looked dejected but calm. He was empty inside. He knew that after his confession, he had no more chances or excuses. As the police escorted Ethan out of the house, neighbors began to peer out of their windows, watching the scene with horror and bewilderment. None of them could believe that this young man, with whom they had lived side by side for so many years, had been arrested for murder. In their eyes, Ethan had always been a quiet and kind guy who helped his parents, was active in the life of the church, and never gave any reason for suspicion. When Ethan got into the police car, there was a mixture of horror and confusion in the eyes of the residents. It seemed that the city had lost its innocence. Everything that had seemed predictable and calm before now became frightening and unknown. People began to ask questions. Who is he really? Has he been hiding the dark side of his personality all these years? Or is this just an accident caused by pressure and emotion? Ethan's arrest was a turning point for everyone. Events that had previously seemed abstract, rumors, speculation, tragic guesses, were now reality. As news of Ethan's arrest spread throughout the city, many people were devastated and confused. Some tried to excuse him, saying it was an accident, that he had simply lost control of himself. Others, on the contrary, began to condemn him, accusing him of all sins and calling him a criminal. Shortly after his arrest, Ethan was transported to the station to be processed and prepared for trial. Jackson knew the case was over legally, but emotionally it was difficult. The case had affected him deeply as a person who was part of this community. He felt a responsibility to the people who were waiting for justice, but he also felt sad and disappointed that such a young man, someone he had known since childhood, had committed such a heinous act. During the days Ethan was in custody, his family tried to stay away from public life. Sarah and John no longer appeared in public, avoiding conversations with neighbors and churchgoers. They did not know how to cope with what had happened. The city community, which had previously always supported each other in difficult times, was now divided into two camps. Some condemned Ethan and his family, others sympathized with them. Understanding that the tragedy had affected everyone, the city newspapers and local TV channels discussed Ethan's arrest and the investigation every day. Everyone tried to understand the reasons for what happened, to understand what exactly led to such a tragedy. The news of Mother Margaret's murder became the main event, and it was discussed not only in the city but also beyond its borders. Meanwhile, at the police station, Jackson and his team continued to analyze all the evidence they had collected to prepare the case for trial. Ethan's confession, fingerprints, blood, and witness statements were key elements of the prosecution. The investigators knew the case would be a big one, and they needed to present all the evidence as clearly and professionally as possible. As the investigation continued, the town became increasingly tense. Many people became afraid to leave their homes at night, even though the killer had been arrested. The shadow of the tragedy that had taken place in the church lay over the entire town. The church, once a symbol of peace and comfort, was now a place that people avoided. No one could bring themselves to cross its threshold after all that had happened. Services were temporarily suspended, and the town seemed to fall into a state of frozen silence. Some of the parishioners who had previously found solace in the prayers and support of the community now felt betrayed. The murder of Margaret, their spiritual mentor, was a blow from which they could not recover. People continued to discuss the events, speculating about Ethan's motives, trying to understand what could have driven him to commit such a crime. But despite all attempts to explain what had happened, the town remained in shock. Ethan's arrest was a turning point for everyone in this small town. People's lives were devastated not only by the tragedy itself, but also by the realization that evil can lurk anywhere, even where you least expect it. A few weeks had passed since Ethan's arrest, and it was time for the trial. The city was preparing for one of the most high-profile trials in decades. Everyone was on edge, knowing that this trial would not only determine Ethan's fate, but would also finally bring closure to the tragedy that had shaken the entire city. Locals gathered to discuss every detail, every rumor, and conversations about what would happen in court could often be heard on the streets. The courthouse was surrounded by journalists, photographers, and TV cameras. News of the case attracted the attention of not only the local press, but also regional media. The reports of Margaret's murder and the arrest of her young assistant caused a storm of discussion, and now everyone was eager to know the outcome of this dramatic case. The day the trial began, the city was almost empty. All the important figures in the community, as well as the families and friends of the victims, gathered in the courthouse. No one could remain indifferent to what was happening, because everyone was involved in this tragedy in one way or another. For Margaret's family, this was the day when they might finally get justice. For Ethan's family, it was the moment when their son would face the consequences of his actions. The trial began with Ethan being led into the courtroom under the gaze of dozens of people. He looked dejected, his face expressionless, as if he had already resigned himself to what was coming. All that remained was to plead guilty and be sentenced. But this day was about more than just formally determining guilt. It was a time for the city to see justice done, to hear both sides speak, and to understand why it happened. The prosecution took the stand first. They laid out the entire crime scene in detail, starting with the fateful night Margaret was killed in the church. They presented all the evidence they had collected that supported the theory that Ethan had acted in a fit of uncontrollable emotion. They cited his confession, in which he described in detail how he had lost control after a confrontation with Margaret. Every detail of the crime was laid out before the court. Fingerprints at the crime scene, traces of blood found in the church, and of course the injuries on Margaret's body, which forensic experts said matched Ethan's story. The evidence was so compelling that the defense was unable to refute it. Particularly impressive to everyone was the testimony of the forensic expert, who confirmed that Margaret's death had occurred instantly after the blow, and that her killer undoubtedly knew her very well. The expert described in detail the injuries sustained by the victim, and described how Margaret could still be alive if she had received help in time. This moment caused waves of regret and grief among those present. Many could not hold back tears as they listened to the details of her death. Following the expert, witnesses took the floor. Parishioners who had seen Ethan on the day of the murder spoke of his strange behavior and frequent visits to Margaret. They confirmed that they had seen him lingering in the church after services, often alone with her. This only increased suspicions that there may have been a closer relationship between them than previously thought. Ethan's defense, in turn, tried to show that he did not act intentionally. The lawyer argued that Ethan was a young, emotionally unstable man who had fallen under the influence of strong feelings. He was not a criminal in the traditional sense of the word, but a victim of his own emotions. The defense insisted that Ethan acted unconsciously, in a state of passion, and did not mean to harm Margaret. However, this did not convince the court. All the evidence, confession, and testimony indicated that Ethan was fully conscious at the time of the crime. He did not simply hit her in a fit of rage, but also tried to cover up his crime by hiding her body in the basement of the church. This fact became key to the court. If Ethan had acted impulsively and was not conscious of his actions, he would not have tried to cover up the evidence of the murder. The prosecutor also reminded the court of Margaret's importance to the community. She was not just a spiritual leader. She represented calm and moral values for the entire town. Her death shocked everyone, and this only increased the emotional tension in the courtroom. During the hearing, the judge listened carefully to both sides. But despite the defense's attempts to soften the case, everything pointed to Ethan's guilt. The closing arguments only confirmed that the court was dealing with a young but fully aware person who had committed a terrible crime. When it came time for sentencing, the courtroom was dead silent. Everyone present, friends, family, journalists, and observers, stood in anticipation. The judge, having reviewed all the case materials and heard both sides, delivered his verdict. Ethan was found guilty of Margaret's murder and faced years behind bars. Margaret's family, present in the courtroom, breathed a sigh of relief, feeling that justice had finally been served. However, this victory in court will not bring back their loved one. For Ethan's family, the verdict was a terrible blow. His mother, Sarah, burst into tears in the courtroom, unable to accept that her son would spend the best years of his life in prison. Ethan's father stood silently, holding back his emotions, but inside he was torn apart by pain and guilt. They could not understand how their son had become a murderer. After the trial, the city slowly began to recover. Residents who had once lived in peace and tranquility now lived with the knowledge that such tragedies could happen even in the most seemingly safe places. The shadow of the tragedy and Ethan's trial left an indelible mark on their lives. After the verdict, life in the small town would never be the same. Ethan's high-profile trial left deep scars on the entire community. People who once prided themselves on their unity now felt divided, as if an invisible rift had run through the community. The church, once a symbol of peace, faith, and morality, now seemed a place full of dark memories. For many residents, Margaret was not just a spiritual guide, but also a symbol of strength and kindness. Her tragic death and the revelation of her private, secret relationship with Ethan destroyed the image of this virtue in the eyes of some. Many parishioners felt betrayed. The church, which had once seemed a sacred place, was now linked to murder and scandal. People began to attend less, some even leaving for other congregations or ceasing their participation in religious life. The atmosphere in the city was one of mistrust, doubt, and a longing for lost innocence. After the trial, many residents began to wonder how it had taken so long to notice the changes in Ethan and Margaret's behavior. How could such a respected woman and spiritual leader allow the situation to spiral out of control? These questions remained unanswered, but the sense of grief and loss was present. Margaret's family tried to rebuild their lives after the tragedy, but her loss was too much for them. Not only was she a spiritual leader for the community, but she was also a loved one who was no longer there. Every time they passed the church, they were reminded of what had happened inside its walls, and it only brought pain. Margaret left a deep mark, but that mark was overshadowed by the tragedy that changed everything. For Ethan's family, the consequences were no less devastating. His mother, Sarah, sank into a deep depression. Her son, whom she had always considered a kind, religious, and obedient boy, had turned out to be a criminal. She could not accept it, could not understand where and when everything had gone wrong. John, Ethan's father, was also experiencing a strong internal shock. He tried to support his wife, but he himself could not come to terms with the fact that their son was involved in such a terrible crime. Their home, which had once been a place of family comfort, was now filled with silence and bitterness. The community, which had once prided itself on its unity, was now deeply divided. Some supported Margaret's family, while others sympathized with Ethan's family. Some residents tried to justify his actions, saying that he was a victim of his own emotions, that he was not a bad person, but simply confused. However, most considered him a murderer whose actions were inexcusable. Since the town was small, rumors and discussions continued. People could not stop talking about the tragedy that had destroyed their usual way of life. Every meeting in the store, every gathering at school or work, was accompanied by conversations about what had happened, who was to blame, and how to live with these events. Some parishioners tried to rebuild the life of the church. They knew they couldn't let the tragedy completely destroy their faith and community. But rebuilding trust was extremely difficult. Many stopped coming to services after the murder, and even those who stayed could not shake off feelings of anxiety and bitterness. The church council decided to close the church for a while for restoration. It was supposed to be a symbol of purification and renewal, but people still could not get rid of the image of the tragedy that happened inside its walls. Despite the efforts, the church could not regain its former authority and respect in the eyes of the people. Local authorities tried to find a way to return the city to its former calm, but the realization that evil could lurk where no one expected it had already penetrated deep into the people's consciousness. Everyone became more suspicious and cautious. Families that had once been friends now avoided each other, fearing that something more might be hidden behind the outward calm. The city had lost its serenity, its trust, and its unity. People no longer looked at each other with the same eyes as before. For many, this tragedy was a reminder of how easy it is to destroy what seemed indestructible. Over time, the town began to adjust to the new reality, but the shadow of the tragedy continued to hang over everyone. People tried to move on, but every time they passed the closed church or saw Ethan on the news, they were overcome with a sense of loss and injustice. For all involved, the tragedy had devastating consequences. Margaret's murder was not just a crime, but a symbol of how one mistake, one uncontrolled emotion, can ruin the lives of many. In the months following the end of the trial and Ethan's sentencing, the town slowly began to return to life. But it was a different life. People were trying to rebuild their lives, but the shadow of the tragedy still hung over them. The internal wounds left by Margaret's death and Ethan's trial were too deep to heal quickly. The church that stood in the center of the city now looked abandoned and lonely. Its doors remained closed, and the restoration work, intended as a symbol of purification, was never completed. The church council did not know how to restore people's trust in this place. Even after a long time, residents avoided looking at the building that had once served as a refuge for them. The city had lost an important symbol of its identity, and now everyone felt as if they had lost a piece of themselves. Those who had previously been active in the community no longer attended services. Many felt betrayed not only by Margaret's murder, but also by the fact that tragedy had struck at the very heart of their spiritual lives. Discussions of what had happened continued behind closed doors, and each time it seemed that nothing would ever be the same again. Margaret's family also could not recover from the loss. Her relatives tried to somehow continue their lives, but the feeling of injustice and loss accompanied them every day. They could no longer find solace in the city where Margaret had spent her entire life, and where everyone now knew her tragic fate. Many of them decided to leave the city, unable to stand being there where every corner reminded them of her. Ethan's family was also going through their own tragedy. Sarah and John, his parents, were in a constant shadow of guilt and public condemnation. His mother, lost in her sense of loss and shame, rarely left the house. John, who had always been a strict and principled man, lost all self-confidence. Both of them felt that they no longer belonged in this town. Ethan's parents could not cope with the fact that their son had become a murderer, and public condemnation only deepened their inner torment. Ethan was in prison, serving his sentence. He spent long hours alone, thinking about what he had done. Every minute spent behind bars was a reminder of the night he lost control and killed Margaret. He found it hard to accept that his life had changed forever, that he would never be able to return to normal. He was overcome with guilt and regret, but nothing could be fixed. In prison, Ethan wrote letters to his parents, trying to stay in touch with them somehow. But their relationship had changed. Sarah and John, despite their love for their son, could no longer look at him with the same eyes. Every time they thought about him, they were reminded of the tragedy that had destroyed their family. The visits to the prison became less frequent, and Ethan began to realize that he was now truly alone. Months passed after the trial, but the town remained in a state of silent grief. Some tried to find new meaning in life, to discover new ways to maintain their faith, but most residents simply tried to move on with their lives, closing their eyes to the memories of the past. People began to realize that life must go on, but the pain of Margaret's loss and the community's split could not disappear so quickly. After some time, the city authorities tried to organize a new event that was supposed to become a symbol of reconciliation and revival. It was decided to open a new church in another place, far from the site of the tragedy. The church council decided to create a new spiritual center that would help the city residents gradually restore faith and trust in each other. The opening ceremony of the new church was quiet and reserved. Locals gathered, but not as many as expected. People were still feeling unsettled, and only a few could afford to openly accept the new chapter in the life of the city. Nevertheless, it was the first step towards recovery. Years passed, and gradually the city began to forget about the tragedy. New families appeared, children appeared, people began to gradually rebuild their lives. However, the memories of Margaret and Ethan will never disappear completely. Those who witnessed those events will keep this story in their memories, reminding themselves how easily one mistake can ruin the lives of many people. The small town never regained its former serenity. The tragedy had changed it forever, and now every resident was more careful in their actions, more suspicious of others. The silence that had once been a symbol of peace was now filled with memories of how one mistake could destroy everything.